Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, 1885. A place where the line between civilization and savagery was drawn in blood, where a woman's worth was measured by her silence, and where justice was whatever the powerful declared it to be. It was here, beneath the merciless western sun, that Anara Stone learned how quickly a town could turn on one of its own. The morning had dawned clear and blistering, the kind of heat that made the distant mountains shimmer like mirages. Anara had risen before first light as always, her hands already raw from scrubbing floors at the Blackwood Manor for nearly 3 years. At 22, her youth was being worn away like river stones, smooth and invisible beneath the current of other people's lives. As the half-Cherokee Maid of the territory's wealthiest family, she existed in the shadows of the grand house, seen only when needed, her copper skin and dark eyes a reminder of what the townsfolk called her divided blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Blackwood family was hosting their annual summer gathering that day. Carriages had been arriving since dawn, bringing the territory's finest in their pressed suits and corseted dresses. Silver gleamed on the long tables set up in the courtyard, crystal glasses catching the sunlight, throwing rainbows against the adobe walls. Anara moved between the guests like a ghost, refilling glasses, replacing empty platters, keeping her eyes lowered as Mrs. Blackwood had instructed. "The help should be invisible," she'd said when first hiring Anara. "Especially one. Like you." Judge Wilson Blackwood stood at the center of the gathering, his white hair blazing in the sun, his voice carrying across the courtyard as he regaled his guests with tales of bringing order to the Arizona Territory. His wife, Eleanor, 20 years, his junior, smiled at his side, her gloved hand holding a silver fan that never seemed to stop its rhythmic movement, as though trying to push away not just the heat, but any hint of impropriety. "Anara," Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Bring more ice from the cellar." Anara nodded, slipping away from the gathering. In the cool darkness of the cellar, she allowed herself a moment's rest, pressing her palms against the stone wall, feeling the blessed coolness against her skin. 3 years in this house, sleeping in a cramped room off the kitchen, working from dawn until the family retired, her wages sent back to her ailing mother on the reservation. 3 years of enduring Mrs. Blackwood's thinly veiled contempt, the judge's lingering glances, and the young Mr. Blackwood's entitled smirks. When she emerged from the cellar, ice bucket in hand, something had changed in the atmosphere of the party. Voices had dropped to whispers, eyes darting toward the house and back again. Mrs. Blackwood stood rigid near the garden entrance, her face pale beneath her parasol. The judge was nowhere to be seen. "You!" Mrs. Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip as she spotted Anara. "Put that down and come here immediately." Confused, Anara set the ice bucket on a nearby table and approached Mrs. Blackwood, conscious of the stares following her movement across the courtyard. "Mrs. Blackwood, is something? My emerald necklace is missing." Mrs. Blackwood's voice was low, but her words carried in the sudden silence that had fallen over the gathering. "The one my husband gave me on our wedding day. I left it on my dressing table this morning and now it's gone." Anara felt her stomach drop. "Ma'am, I haven't been in your bedroom today." "Don't lie to me, girl." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "You were seen entering my chambers not an hour ago." "No, ma'am. I was preparing the desserts in the kitchen, then bringing out refreshments. You can ask cook." "Are you calling my son a liar?" Mrs. Blackwood hissed, glancing toward young Thomas Blackwood, who stood among his friends, watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. "He saw you himself." Thomas nodded, his handsome face a mask of concern that didn't reach his eyes. "I was passing Mother's room and saw the maid inside. I thought nothing of it at the time." Anara's heart began to race. She'd avoided being alone with Thomas since the night 6 months ago when he'd cornered her in the pantry. his hands grasping at her waist, his breath hot with whiskey against her neck. She'd pushed him away, harder than she'd intended, sending him stumbling back against the shelves. A jar had fallen, shattering at his feet. He'd looked at the broken glass, then back at her, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "I'll remember this," he'd said quietly, before leaving her trembling in the dark. Now, standing in the brilliant sunlight with dozens of eyes upon her, Anara recognized the fulfillment of that promise. "I didn't take anything, Mrs. Blackwood. Search." "Her!" ordered a voice from the crowd. Judge Blackwood had reappeared, his face flushed with anger or perhaps the summer heat. Two of the judge's men stepped forward, grabbing Anara by the arms. She didn't struggle. She knew what happened to Indian girls who fought back against white men. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I've served your family faithfully. I wouldn't steal from you." "Check her quarters," the judge commanded, ignoring her plea. And her person, Mrs. Blackwood herself, led the way to Anara's small room. The search was brief and humiliating. They emptied her meager possessions onto the floor. The worn dress she'd arrived in 3 years ago, now too small. The beaded bracelet her mother had made. The book of poetry a kind guest had once given her, noticing her lingering gaze on the library shelves. "There," said Thomas, who had followed the search party. He pointed to Anara's thin mattress. Mrs. Blackwood reached beneath it and withdrew the emerald necklace, the green stones catching the light that streamed through the small window. "No," Anara whispered, her composure finally breaking. "I didn't put that there. I wouldn't—" "Silence!" Judge Blackwood's voice filled the small room. "The evidence speaks for itself." They dragged her from the house, back through the whispering crowd, and into the town square. News traveled fast in Willow Creek. By the time they reached the square, with its central platform used for announcements and occasional hangings, a crowd had gathered. Children pointed, women whispered behind their hands, men stood with arms crossed, judgment already written on their faces. Sheriff Calloway waited on the platform, his grey moustache twitching nervously as the judge approached. They spoke in low tones, the sheriff nodding occasionally, glancing at Anara with something that might have been pity buried beneath official resolve. "Folks of Willow Creek," Judge Blackwood addressed the gathering, his judicial robes replaced. By the fine suit he'd worn for the party, his authority no less diminished. "We have a crime to address. This girl," he gestured to Anara, held firmly between 2 deputies, "has betrayed the trust of my family and stolen property of significant value." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Always knew she was trouble," someone said loudly enough to be heard. "Can't trust that mixed blood." "Half-breed probably has relatives among those Apache raiders," another voice called out. "Cherokee ain't Apache." An old man corrected, but few were listening. "As judge of this territory," Blackwood continued, "I could send her to prison for theft. However, given the current overcrowding at the territorial facility, and considering this is her first known offense, I am inclined toward leniency." Anara nearly laughed at the word. There was nothing of leniency in the judge's eyes, only cold. "Calculation. The girl will receive 15 lashes here before you all, as a warning against such betrayals of trust. Sheriff, proceed." "Judge Blackwood," Sheriff Calloway stepped forward, his voice low. "Perhaps a night in the jail would suffice. The girl is—" "The sentence stands, Sheriff." The judge's voice left no room for debate. "Unless you wish to challenge my authority in this matter." The sheriff's gaze dropped. "No, sir." They bound, her wrists to the whipping post that stood to one side of the platform, rarely used but maintained as a reminder of the consequences of serious transgressions. Anara didn't struggle as they tore the back of her dress open, exposing her skin to the crowd. Her mind had retreated to a quiet place, a skill learned long ago when the world became too harsh to bear. She thought of her mother, Niabi, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. A Cherokee woman who had left her people to marry a white settler, only to be widowed when Anara was just 7. She thought of the stories her mother told of the forced march west, what the Cherokee called the trail where they cried. She thought of her mother's hands, once strong enough to carry her for miles, now twisted with arthritis and barely able to weave the baskets she sold for pennies. The first lash tore through her thoughts and her flesh simultaneously. A line of fire exploded across her back, stealing her breath. The second followed quickly, crossing the first. By the third, she had bitten her lip bloody to keep from crying out. She would not give them the satisfaction of her screams. Through the haze of pain, she became aware of movement on the edge of the crowd. A tall figure on horseback had appeared, watching the proceedings from the shadow of the general store. Even in her agony, she registered that he was not from Willow Creek. His stillness stood in stark contrast to the restless energy of the townspeople. The whip fell again and again. Blood ran hot down her back, soaking what remained of her dress. Her knees buckled, but the ropes kept her upright, adding the strain of her own weight to her torture. Still, she made no sound beyond the involuntary gasp of breath that accompanied each strike. By the 10th lash, the crowd had grown uncomfortable. This was not the entertainment some had expected. The girl's silence was somehow more disturbing than screams would have been. Women turned away, ushering children home. Men shifted their weight, gazes dropping to the dust. Only Thomas Blackwood watched with undisguised satisfaction, his eyes never leaving the torn flesh of her back. When the 15th lash finally fell, Anara was barely conscious. They cut her down, and she collapsed onto the wooden platform, blood pooling beneath her. The crowd dispersed quickly, no one wanting to witness the aftermath of what they had tacitly approved. "Get her out of the square," Judge Blackwood ordered, already turning away. "She's no longer welcome in this town." "Sir," Sheriff Calloway protested, "she needs a doctor." "What she needs," the judge said coldly, "is to understand her place in this world. Let her people tend to her, if she can find her way back to them." The judge and his family departed, returning to their interrupted celebration. The sheriff knelt beside Anara, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Stone," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, this wasn't right." Anara couldn't answer. The world swam before her eyes, darkness encroaching from the edges of her vision. She was vaguely aware of the sheriff ordering one of his deputies to fetch water, of gentle hands trying to clean the worst of the blood. "Step away from her." The voice was deep, commanding, and unfamiliar. Anara forced her eyes open. The stranger she had noticed during her punishment now stood at the edge of the platform. Up close, he was unlike any man she had seen in Willow Creek. Tall and broad-shouldered, his copper skin was darker than hers, weathered by sun and wind. His black hair was pulled back from a face marked by both strength and sorrow. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache and cavalry clothing, buckskin pants, a cotton shirt, and a U.S. Army jacket that seemed at odds with the rest of his appearance. Most striking were his eyes, dark as obsidian, but burning with an inner fire that made the sheriff take an involuntary step backward. "This ain't your concern, Chief," the sheriff said, his hand moving toward his holster. "Move along now." "My name is Dakota," the man said, ignoring the sheriff's warning gesture. "I am no longer chief of anything." He looked down at Anara, his expression unreadable. "But I will not leave her to die for your people's idea of justice." "Now listen here," the sheriff began, but fell silent as Dakota moved onto the platform with the fluid grace of a predator. "You had your chance to protect her," Dakota said, his voice low but carrying across the now empty square. "You failed." He knelt beside Anara, his movements gentle despite his imposing presence. "Can you hear me?" he asked softly. Anara managed. A slight nod, pain shooting through her body at even this small movement. "I'm taking you away from this place," he said. "They will not touch you again." With infinite care, he wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, covering her torn dress and the wounds beneath. Then he lifted her as though she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest to minimize pressure on her back. "Stop right there." The sheriff had found his courage, or perhaps his sense of duty. He drew his pistol. "Put her down. She's still in custody until the judge says otherwise." Dakota turned slowly, Anara secure in his arms. Something in his eyes made the sheriff's hand tremble slightly. "Would you kill me to keep her here?" Dakota asked quietly. "To return her to the people who did this?" The sheriff's resolve visibly faltered. He glanced around the empty square, at the blood staining the platform, at the young woman barely conscious in the Apache's arms. "Her wounds need tending," he said finally, lowering his weapon. "And the judge made it clear she's banished from town." He hesitated, then added, "I don't know what your interest is in this girl, but if you're meaning to help her, I won't stand in your way." Dakota nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than gratitude. He carried Anara to his horse, a powerful black stallion that stood calmly as he mounted with her still in his arms, arranging her carefully across his lap. As they rode away, from Willow Creek, Anara drifted in and out of consciousness. She was aware of the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her, of strong arms keeping her from falling, of a voice occasionally murmuring words in a language she didn't understand, but which somehow soothed her fevered mind. Her last thought before darkness claimed her completely was a question she couldn't voice. Why would an Apache warrior rescue a half-Cherokee maid he had never met? The answer would change everything she thought she knew about fate, justice, and the unexpected paths to healing in a broken world. Dakota rode until the moon rose high above the desert landscape, the silver light transforming the rugged terrain into something otherworldly. Anara drifted between consciousness and darkness, the pain from her torn flesh occasionally pulling her back to awareness. In these brief moments of lucidity, she registered the steady heartbeat beneath her cheek, the careful way the stranger adjusted his hold to minimize her suffering, and the soft words in Apache that seemed more prayer than conversation. When they finally stopped, it was at a small hidden canyon invisible from the main trail. A stream trickled between stone walls, feeding a small pool bordered by cottonwood trees. The air was cooler here, the night sounds of the desert muted by the encircling rock. Dakota dismounted with Anara still in his arms, carrying her to a flat stone beside the pool. With practiced movements, he gathered dried herbs from a pouch at his belt, crushing them between calloused fingers before sprinkling them into a small pot of water he set to boil over a hastily built fire. "This will help with the pain," he said, speaking English for the first time since leaving Willow Creek. His voice was deep and resonant, his accent subtle but present in the careful way he formed each word. Anara struggled to focus on his face in the flickering firelight. "Why?" she managed to whisper, her throat parched from the long ride and her ordeal. Dakota paused in his preparation, studying her with those penetrating obsidian eyes. "Why did I take you? Or why did they hurt you?" "Both," she said, wincing as she tried to shift to a more comfortable position. He handed her a water skin, supporting her head as she drank. "They hurt you because fear makes people cruel," he said simply. "As for why I took you..." He turned back to the boiling herbs, their pungent aroma filling the small canyon. "No one deserves to be left bleeding in the dust." It wasn't a complete answer, but Anara lacked the strength to press further. She watched as he soaked strips of clean cloth in the herbal mixture, wringing them out with strong, sure hands. "This will sting," he warned, "but then bring numbness. The wounds must be cleaned to prevent fever." Anara nodded weakly, bracing herself. When the first herb-soaked cloth touched her torn flesh, she couldn't suppress a gasp of pain. Dakota worked, methodically cleaning each lash mark with gentle precision. "You made no sound when they whipped you," he observed, his voice neutral. "Few can endure such pain in silence." "My mother taught me," Anara said through gritted teeth. "When they force you to kneel, stand tall inside." Dakota's hands paused momentarily. "Your mother is wise." "Cherokee," Anara explained, finding strange comfort in conversation that distracted from the pain. "She walked the trail of tears as a child." Understanding flickered across Dakota's face. The forced relocation of the Cherokee was known even among the Apache, another chapter in the long history of broken promises and stolen lands. "And your father?" he asked, applying a poultice of crushed leaves to the worst of her wounds. "White settler. Died when I was young." She closed her eyes, memories surfacing through the fog of pain. "My mother loved him, despite what his people did to hers. I never understood how." Dakota began wrapping clean bandages around her torso, his movements efficient, yet careful not to cause additional pain. "Love does not always follow the paths we expect," he said enigmatically. When he finished, he helped her drink a bitter tea, brewed from different herbs. "For sleep and healing," he explained. "The night will be difficult, but by morning the worst will have passed." As the medicine took effect, dulling the sharp edges of her pain, Anara found herself studying her mysterious rescuer. In the firelight, she could see scars on his hands and forearms, old wounds speaking of a violent past. Yet those same hands had tended her injuries with a healer's touch. "You called yourself Dakota," she murmured, fighting the heaviness of her eyelids. "You said you're no longer chief. What happened?" A shadow passed over his face. "That is a story for another time," he said, arranging a blanket to cushion her from the hard ground. "Rest now." Despite her curiosity, Anara couldn't resist the pull of the medicinal tea. As consciousness slipped away, she felt safer than she had any right to feel in the company of a stranger. She dreamed of fire and blood, of Thomas Blackwood's mocking smile, of the whip cutting through air and flesh. In her dreams, she finally screamed, the sound echoing against canyon walls. She jerked awake to find Dakota's hand on her shoulder, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're safe." Dawn was breaking, pale fingers of light reaching into their sheltered canyon. Anara was surprised to find the pain in her back had indeed subsided to a dull throb, the fever she had feared held at bay by Dakota's medicine. "How do you feel?" he asked, offering her water. "Better than I should," she admitted, accepting the water skin. "Your medicine is strong." "Apache remedies, learned from my grandmother." A hint of pride touched his voice. "She was our tribe's healer before the soldiers came." Anara nodded, piecing together fragments of the man before her, former chief, grandson of a healer, a man who spoke both Apache and English, who wore an army jacket yet clearly held no love for the soldiers he mentioned. "Can you eat?" he asked, interrupting her thoughts. He offered a strip of dried meat and a handful of piñon nuts. "We have a long ride ahead." "Where are we going?" Anara asked, accepting the food. "Away from Willow Creek," Dakota said, as if that were explanation enough. He busied himself breaking camp, his movements economical and practiced. "I need to send word to my mother," Anara said, struggling to sit up straighter. "She's on the San Carlos reservation. She depends on the money I send." Dakota paused in his work, a flicker of something, recognition, concern, crossing his features. "San Carlos," he repeated. "How long has she been there?" "Nearly 2 years. They relocated her from the Cherokee lands when she returned after my father died." Bitterness crept into Anara's voice. "They said a Cherokee had no business living alone in Arizona territory, especially one who had married a white man." Dakota nodded slowly. "I know San Carlos. We can send word when it's safe." He resumed packing, avoiding her eyes. "You still haven't told me why you helped me," Anara pressed, stronger now with food in her stomach and the worst of the pain controlled by his medicine. Takoda secured the last of his supplies to his horse before answering. When he finally turned to her, his expression had changed, something harder and more haunted, replacing his healer's calm. "3 moons ago, I watched as soldiers flogged my brother to death in a fort not unlike your Willow Creek," he said, each word precise and heavy with controlled rage. "His crime was leaving San Carlos without permission to gather traditional medicines for our ailing children. He made no sound, just as you did not. His dignity in the face of their cruelty." He paused, memory clouding his eyes. "When I saw you yesterday, enduring the same punishment with the same silence, I could not stand aside a second time." The weight of his confession hung in the air between them. Anara understood now. Not just compassion, but a kind of redemption had driven him to intervene. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said softly. Takoda acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "Can you ride?" he asked, changing the subject abruptly. Anara assessed her condition honestly. "Not well, but better than yesterday." "We cannot stay here. The judge may send men after us." "After you," Anara corrected. "I was banished, remember? They don't want me back." "They want what you represent even less," Takoda said grimly. "A half-Cherokee woman rescued by an Apache warrior? That challenges everything they believe about their superiority. Men like your judge cannot allow such challenges to go unanswered." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed slightly. The movement sent fresh waves of pain across her back, but it was manageable now, a fire banked rather than raging. "I never thanked you," she realized suddenly, "for saving my life." Takoda's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You endured. I merely witnessed." He helped her onto his horse, adjusting her position to minimize pressure on her wounds before mounting behind her. "Now we must ensure your endurance was not in vain." They rode north, avoiding the main trails, Takoda choosing paths that seemed invisible until they were upon them. He explained that they were following ancient Apache routes, known only to those taught by the elders. "Where are we going?" Anara asked again, as they paused to rest the horse near midday. This time, Takoda gave her a more substantial answer. "There is a place between the Red Canyons and the high mountains, a valley the army has not found. Some call it Dine Ta Naz Nili, flowing through the land of the people." "Your people? Not only Apache," he said, "those who have no other home, those the white man's world has cast aside." He looked at her directly. "It is not an easy life, but it is a free one." "And my mother?" Anara persisted. "I can't abandon her." "Once you are healed, we will find a way to reach her," Takoda promised. "If she wishes to join us in the valley, she will be welcome." As they continued their journey, the landscape changed, becoming more dramatic, towering red rock formations giving way to pine-covered slopes as they climbed in elevation. Takoda remained alert, frequently stopping to study their back trail or to listen to the sounds of the wilderness around them. "You believe they're following," Anara observed after one such pause. "I believe men like Judge Blackwood do not surrender what they consider their property," Takoda replied. "Whether that property is land, justice, or the right to punish those beneath them." His assessment matched what Anara had come to know of the judge during her years in his household. Blackwood collected slights and grievances like other men collected trophies, displaying them at opportune moments to remind others of his power. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered over the mountains ahead, promising an evening storm. Takoda led them to a small cave set high in a sandstone wall, accessible only by a narrow, winding path that would be nearly invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. "We'll shelter here tonight," he said, helping Anara dismount. The Rain will cover our tracks. The cave was surprisingly comfortable, with evidence of previous use, a stone-ringed fire pit, stacks of dry wood, even crude shelves carved into the rock holding clay pots and woven baskets. "You've been here before," Anara noted, easing herself onto a bed of pine boughs that cushioned the cave floor. "Many times," Dakota confirmed, kindling a small fire. "This was a hunting camp for my people before the reservation. Now it serves as a way station for those traveling to the valley." "There are others like us?" Anara asked, the concept of a community of outcasts both surprising and comforting. "More than you might imagine." Dakota settled across from her, the fire between them casting long shadows against the cave walls. "Those who do not fit into the neat categories the white man has created, half-bloods, former slaves, tribal members who refused reservation life, even some whites who rejected their society's cruelty. The idea was almost too much to hope for, a place where her mixed heritage might be accepted rather than scorned. Anara had spent her life caught between worlds, never fully belonging to either her mother's people or her father's. "Why do you look doubtful?" Dakota asked, reading her expression with unsettling accuracy. "Hope is dangerous," she replied honestly. "I learned long ago that safety lies in expecting little." Dakota's rare smile transformed his stern features, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been in a different world. "Perhaps, but without hope, what remains worth fighting for?" The question lingered in the small cave as rain began to drum against the stone outside, a rhythmic counterpoint to the crackling fire. For the first time since the whipping post, Anara felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. "Tell me about the valley," she said, settling more comfortably on her pine bed. "Tell me about this place where hope might not be dangerous." And as the storm raged outside their sanctuary, Dakota spoke of a hidden world where the boundaries between tribes had dissolved in the face of shared struggle, where ancient enemies had learned to live as reluctant neighbors and then as friends, where children of mixed blood were valued for bridging worlds rather than condemned for belonging to none. Whether such a paradise could truly exist, Anara couldn't be certain. But as she drifted off to sleep, soothed by Dakota's deep voice and the gentle patter of rain, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond service and suffering, a life where her divided blood might become a strength rather than a curse. Morning broke with startling clarity after the night storm. The desert air scrubbed clean and fragrant with pine and wet stone. Anara awoke to find Dakota already outside the cave, a silhouette against the rising sun as he scanned the horizon. Her back felt remarkably better. Still painful, but the worst of the inflammation had subsided under Dakota's careful treatment. "This rain has covered our trail," he announced as she joined him at the cave entrance, moving more freely than she had the previous day. "But we should not linger." They broke their fast with dried berries and what remained of the previous day's journey. Bread. As they ate, Anara studied Dakota with new eyes, seeing beyond her initial impression of the stoic warrior. In the morning light, she noticed details that had escaped her before. The intricate beadwork on his leather belt, the subtle silver, work on his knife sheath, the 3 faded parallel scars that traced his left jawline like claw marks. "You're watching me," he observed without looking up from his meal. "Trying to understand you," Anara admitted, unembarrassed at being caught. "Yesterday you spoke of your brother and your grandmother the healer. Tell me more of your people." Dakota gave her a measured look, as if weighing how much to reveal. "What would you know? How did you become chief?" She gestured to his U.S. Army jacket. "And why do you wear that?" A shadow crossed his face. "One question answers the other." He set aside his food, brushing his hands against his buckskin pants. "I was never meant to be chief. That was my older brother's destiny. I was to be a healer like my grandmother." What changed? The white man's hunger for our land. His voice remained level, but Anara sensed the controlled rage beneath. When the army came to force us onto San Carlos, many of our warriors wanted to fight. My brother counseled peace, believing promises that we would be treated fairly on the reservation. A bitter smile touched his lips. The army recognized his influence. They made him their instrument, a bridge between worlds, they called it. They gave him that jacket. Takoda touched the worn blue fabric, his fingers tracing a tear near the shoulder that had been carefully mended. He signed their papers, led our people to San Carlos. Only then did we learn the truth of reservation life, starvation rations, disease, land that would not grow our crops. When children began dying, my brother left to gather medicine from our sacred places. You know how that ended. And you became chief in his place, Anara said softly. Takoda nodded once. The elders said the spirits had shifted the burden to my shoulders. I wore his jacket to remember his mistake, trusting those who see us only as obstacles. Yet you speak their language well. I studied at their mission school when I was young, before I understood what they were taking from me. He stood abruptly. We should go. The day grows older while we speak of things that cannot be changed. They broke camp efficiently, Takoda adjusting the horse's tack while Anara gathered their few belongings. Her movements were less fluid than usual, but the improvement in her condition was remarkable, a testament to both Takoda's healing knowledge and her own resilience. As they prepared to leave, a distant sound froze them both, the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoing across the canyon. Takoda was instantly alert, motioning for Anara to retreat into the cave while he moved silently to a better vantage point. 3 riders, he reported moments later, his voice barely above a whisper. Following our trail from yesterday. The rain confused them, but they're persistent. Blackwood's men, Anara asked, fear rising like bile in her throat. One wears a deputy's badge, the others are trackers, Navajo by their dress. Takoda's expression hardened. Hired guns who know this country. What do we do? Takoda considered for a moment. We can't outrun them with 2 on 1 horse. We need to split their party. He returned to the cave, gathering specific items from his supplies, a small mirror, ammunition, flint and steel. I'll lead them away from our true path. You'll continue. North with the horse. Alone, alarm colored Anara's voice. I don't know the way to your valley. You won't reach it today. Takoda withdrew a folded piece of deerskin from his saddlebag, carefully unrolling it to reveal a crude map drawn in charcoal. Follow this creek bed, he traced a line with his finger, until you reach the split rock that resembles a bear's head. From there, travel east until dusk. You'll find a stand of cottonwoods beside a sacred spring. Wait for me there. And if you don't come? Anara couldn't help asking. Takoda's dark eyes met hers. Then continue north at first light. Look for 3 stones stacked like this. He demonstrated with a quick gesture. They mark the hidden paths. The valley people will find you. He handed her his knife, the blade polished to a mirror finish, the handle worn smooth from years of use. Take this. Use it only if you must. Anara accepted the knife, the weight of it unfamiliar in her hand. I've never killed anything. Then, pray you need not start today. Takoda gathered the last of what he needed, his movements quick but unhurried. Wait until midday before leaving. By then, I'll have drawn them well away from here. Before she could respond, he grasped her shoulder gently. You survived the whipping post without breaking. You will survive this too. With those words, he slipped from the cave like a shadow detaching itself from darkness, moving so silently down the rocky path that even watching, Anara could barely track his progress. Left alone, she tried to quell the fear rising within her. The cave, which had felt like sanctuary the previous night, now seemed exposed and vulnerable. Every sound, a lizard skittering across stone, the wind whispering through juniper, heightened her anxiety. To calm herself, she focused on practical tasks. She checked and rechecked the horse's saddle, rearranged their supplies for better balance, studied Dakota's map until she was certain she could find the landmarks he'd described. The physical activity helped, but couldn't entirely banish the dread of what might happen if Blackwood's men found her instead of Dakota. By midday, the sun had reached its zenith, beating down on the red rocks surrounding the cave. Anara gathered her courage and led the horse carefully down the narrow path. Once on more level ground, she mounted awkwardly, her back protesting the movement, but not nearly as severely as she had feared. She followed Dakota's directions, guiding the horse along a dry creek bed that wound between towering sandstone formations. The landscape was both beautiful and alien to her, so different from the lush Cherokee lands of her mother's stories or the settled town of Willow Creek, where she had spent the last 3 years. After an hour's careful travel, she spotted the bear-shaped rock Dakota had described. It loomed over the creek bed like a sentinel, its features eroded by wind and time, but still distinctly ursine. Here, she turned east, as instructed, leaving the relative cover of the creek bed for more exposed terrain. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Anara pulled her shawl over her head for protection. Her wounds throbbed in time with the horse's gait, but the pain was manageable. Another debt she owed to Dakota's healing skills. As afternoon waned, she found herself scanning the horizon, not just for the promised cottonwoods, but for any sign of pursuit. The vast emptiness that surrounded her was both blessing and curse. No place for enemies to hide, but nowhere for her to conceal herself either. When she finally spotted the stand of cottonwoods in the distance, their green leaves an oasis amid the red and amber landscape, relief flooded through her. She urged the tired horse forward, eager to reach the shelter and water Dakota had promised. The spring was exactly as he had described, a clear pool fed by water that seemed to emerge miraculously from the rocky ground. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the stone walls surrounding it, faded images of deer, spiral patterns, and handprints pressed into the rock centuries ago. Anara dismounted carefully, leading the horse to water before seeing to her own thirst. She unsaddled the animal, setting up a small camp in the shelter of the largest cottonwood. As dusk approached, she built a small fire as Dakota had taught her, keeping it low and feeding it with dry wood that produced minimal smoke. Night fell, and still Dakota did not return. Anara tried not to dwell on what that might mean. Instead, she occupied herself with changing her bandages, using the medicinal herbs he had packed for just this purpose. The wounds were healing cleanly. Painful still, but showing no signs of infection, she wrapped herself in a blanket as the desert night grew cold, staring into the dying embers of her small fire. The stars emerged in their thousands, more brilliant than she had ever seen them in Willow Creek, where the glow of lamps and lanterns dimmed the celestial display. Her mother had taught her the Cherokee star names when she was young. The Pleiades were the 7 boys dancing. Orion was the way of souls. Anara wondered what names the Apache gave these same patterns of light, and if perhaps the different people's stories might somehow all be true simultaneously. The thought comforted her as she drifted towards sleep, the soft nickering of the horse and the gentle rustling of cottonwood leaves forming a lullaby unlike any she had known before. Sound jolted her awake, a displacement of air rather than a noise, the sense of another presence nearby. Anara's hand went immediately to Dakota's knife, hidden beneath her blanket. The fire had burned to nothing, but the moonlight bathed the clearing in silver, bright enough to cast shadows. "It's me." Dakota's voice came softly from the darkness. Relief swept through her as he materialized from the shadows, moving with the same silent grace she had already come to associate with him. But as he came closer, she gasped. A dark stain spread across his left shoulder, and he moved with a slight limp that hadn't been there before. "You're hurt," she said, rising quickly to meet him. "It's nothing," he replied, though his face was drawn with pain and fatigue. "A bullet grazed my arm. The leg is from a fall." "Let me see." Anara guided him to her small camp, rekindling the fire with practiced movements. "You tended my wounds. Now I'll tend yours." To her surprise, Takoda didn't argue. He sank down beside the fire, allowing her to examine his injuries. The bullet wound was indeed a graze, painful but not life-threatening. The leg injury concerned her more, a deep gash that ran from knee to mid-calf, already showing signs of inflammation. "This needs cleaning," she said, reaching for the medicine pouch. "You know how to use these?" he asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "My mother is Cherokee, remember? She taught me our healing ways." Anara set water to boil, adding the herbs in specific proportions. Different plants, same principles. As she worked on his wounds, Takoda related what had happened. After they separated, he had successfully led the pursuers away, but one, sharper-eyed than the others, had spotted the ruse. In the ensuing confrontation, Takoda had been wounded, but managed to escape into terrain too dangerous for horses, leaving the trackers no choice but to return to Willow Creek empty-handed. "They'll report failure," he concluded, as Anara finished, bandaging his leg. "But that won't be the end. The judge will send others." "Why?" Anara asked, sitting back on her heels. "Why expend such effort for a half-breed maid and an Apache warrior? Neither of us means anything to him." "Pride," Takoda said simply. "Men like Blackwood cannot tolerate defiance. Each day we remain free is an insult to his authority." He studied her face in the firelight. "There may be more. His son seemed particularly angered by your escape." Anara's stomach twisted at the mention of Thomas Blackwood. "We have history," she admitted reluctantly. "He tried to force himself on me once. I resisted." Understanding dawned in Takoda's eyes. The theft accusation was revenge. "Yes." She looked away, shame coloring her voice, though she had done nothing wrong. "I should have seen it coming. Predators hide their nature until they strike," Takoda said, his tone hardening. "The blame is not yours to carry." They fell silent, the crackling fire and night sounds of the desert filling the space between them. Finally, Anara spoke again. "What happens now?" Takoda gazed into the flames, his expression thoughtful. "We rest. Tomorrow we continue to the valley. Your wounds are healing well, and mine will not slow us much. And my mother, you promised we would find a way to reach her." "I keep my promises," Takoda said, meeting her eyes across the fire. "But first we must ensure your safety. Then we will plan her rescue." The word rescue hung in the air between them. Until that moment, Anara had thought of her mother's situation as unfortunate but legal. The government's right to relocate indigenous peoples was not something she had dared to question openly. Yet here was Takoda, former chief and current outlaw, speaking of rescuing her mother from San Carlos, as if it were no different from rescuing Anara herself from the whipping post. Perhaps it wasn't. As the night deepened around them, something shifted in Anara's understanding of herself and the world that had shaped her. She had spent her life trying to navigate between two cultures, never fully belonging to either. But in this moment, with this man, she began to glimpse the possibility of a different way, not caught between worlds, but creating something new from the broken pieces of both. "Tell me more about your valley," she said softly, and as the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of night, Takoda spoke of the community that awaited them, a place built not on blood or birthright, but on the shared desire for freedom and dignity that transcended tribal boundaries and racial divisions. Whether from exhaustion, his injuries, or the rare sense of safety their partnership had created, something in Takoda had softened. The warrior's mask slipped, revealing glimpses of the healer he might have become in a different life, thoughtful, articulate, with an unexpected depth of vision for what the future might hold if people could move beyond the hatreds of the past. Dawn would bring new challenges, new dangers. But in this moment, beneath ancient stars and beside a sacred spring, two outcasts had formed a bond stronger than either could have anticipated, a connection forged in shared suffering, but tempered with something rarer, the first fragile tendrils of hope. 3 days of hard travel had brought them to the foothills of mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Peaks crowned with snow despite the summer heat loomed ahead, their lower slopes thick with pine and aspen. The terrain had changed dramatically as they ascended, desert giving way to scrubland, then to forest, each transition bringing new challenges and new beauty. Anara sat beside a rushing stream, refilling their water skins, while Takoda checked for signs of pursuit. The cold mountain water soothed her hands, chapped from days in the saddle. Her back had healed remarkably well, the wounds now pink scars rather than raw flesh, though they still pulled uncomfortably when she made sudden movements. "We're being followed again," Takoda announced, returning silently from his reconnaissance. His own injuries had improved, though he still favored his wounded leg slightly. Anara's heart sank. "Blackwood's men?" "No." Takoda knelt beside her, washing trail dust from his face. "Different trackers, more skilled. They're staying just far enough back to avoid detection, but I found signs, crushed grass where they rested, the remains of a small fire. How many?" "4, maybe 5. One wears cavalry boots." His expression darkened. "Army scouts." The news chilled Anara more than the mountain stream. Blackwood's men were dangerous, but the U.S. Army was a different threat entirely. They would have resources, training, and the full authority of the government behind them. "Why would the Army care about us?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. "They don't care about you," Takoda said bluntly, "but I am still considered a renegade chief. There's likely a bounty for my capture." He glanced at her. "You should know, if they catch us, they'll separate us. You'll be sent to a reservation or back to Willow Creek. I'll be hanged if I'm lucky enough to make it to trial." Anara absorbed this grim assessment, turning over options in her mind. "Could we reach your valley before they catch us?" "Not on our current path. It's still 2 days' travel, and we're slowed by sharing one horse." Takoda studied the mountains thoughtfully. "There is another way, harder, steeper, but it might throw them off our trail." "Then that's what we do," Anara said without hesitation. Takoda looked at her with something like approval. "The path crosses Ghost Canyon. Few dare to travel it, even among my people. The spirits of those who died in the Great Plague still wander there." Anara had heard enough stories from her mother to respect such warnings. "Are you afraid?" "Not of ghosts," Takoda said with the hint of a smile. "But the canyon is treacherous in other ways. Narrow trails along cliff faces, loose rock, flash floods if rain comes." "Still better than a hangman's noose," Anara pointed. "Out." They broke camp quickly, leaving false signs that suggested they had continued along the easier route before doubling back to a nearly invisible game trail that climbed steeply into the mountains. The horse struggled on the rocky terrain, forcing them to dismount and lead it up the steepest sections. By midday, they had ascended high enough that the valley below was spread out like a map. In the far distance, Anara could just make out tiny figures on horseback, their pursuers still following the main trail. "We've bought some time," Takoda observed, "but once they realize we've changed course, they'll find our true path." They pushed on through the afternoon, the trail growing increasingly difficult. Takoda moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had traversed these mountains many times, while Anara struggled to match his pace, her town-bred legs unused to such demanding terrain. Late in the day, They reached the rim of Ghost Canyon. Anara gasped at the sight. The canyon cut through the mountain like a wound, its walls nearly vertical in places, dropping hundreds of feet to a thin silver thread of water below. Ancient pines clung impossibly to the rocky faces, their twisted forms sculpted by wind and hardship. "We'll camp here tonight," Takoda decided, leading them to a small clearing sheltered by overhanging rock. The descent begins at dawn. That night was colder than any Anara had experienced since leaving Willow Creek. They built a fire in the shelter of the rocks, keeping it small to avoid detection. As they shared their meager rations, Takoda seemed preoccupied, his gaze frequently turning toward the canyon. "You're worried about tomorrow," Anara observed. "The descent is dangerous in the best conditions," he admitted. "And there's something else." He hesitated, then continued. "The last time I crossed Ghost Canyon was with my brother, before the army came." Anara understood the weight of that memory. "Tell me about him," she invited softly. "What was his name?" "Nashoba," Takoda said, the name clearly precious to him. "It means wolf in our language. He earned it as a boy, tracking a wolf pack for 3 days without rest." "Was he much older than you?" "4 summers. We lost our parents to smallpox when I was 12. Nashoba raised me, taught me to hunt, to fight." A rare smile touched Takoda's lips. He had less patience for the healing arts our grandmother tried to teach us both. That became my path alone. Anara tried to imagine Takoda as a boy, learning to identify healing plants, to set bones, to ease pain. So different from the warrior he had been forced to become. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Becoming chief instead of healer?" Takoda considered the question with the thoughtfulness she had come to expect from him. "I regret the necessity," he said finally, "but not the choice itself. When Nashoba died, our people needed protection more than healing." They fell silent then, each lost in private thoughts as the fire burned low. Anara found herself wondering what her own life might have been had circumstances been different, if her father had lived, if her mother hadn't been relocated, if she hadn't been forced into service at the Blackwood house. Morning came with a sky the color of bruised plums, clouds gathering ominously over the peaks above. Takoda studied them with concern. "Rain is coming. We must cross the canyon before it reaches us." They began the descent immediately, leaving most of their supplies cached beneath the overhanging rock to lighten the horses' load. The trail, if it could be called that, was little more than a series of switchbacks etched into the canyon wall, in places barely wide enough for the horse to pass. Takoda led, guiding the animal with quiet words and a firm hand on its bridle. Anara followed, trying not to look at the dizzying drop to her right. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain and making the pines along the cliff face sway alarmingly. "Steady," Takoda called back to her as she hesitated at a particularly narrow section. "Watch where I place my feet. Nothing else." She nodded, focusing on the path immediately before her, on Takoda's sure movements, on anything but the emptiness beside her. They descended in this manner for nearly 2 hours, the canyon walls closing in around them as they neared the bottom. They were perhaps halfway down when the first drops of rain began to fall. Fat, heavy splashes that darkened the rock instantly. Within minutes, the shower had become a downpour, turning the already treacherous path into a slick, muddy channel. "We need to find shelter," Takoda shouted over the growing roar of water. "The flash flood will come soon." He pointed to a hollow in the cliff face some distance ahead, a shallow cave that might offer protection from the worst of the storm. They pressed forward, moving as quickly as safety allowed, the horse growing increasingly nervous as thunder echoed through the canyon. They were within 50 yards of the shelter when disaster struck. A section of the path, weakened by the rain, gave way beneath the horse's hooves. The animal screamed in terror, its hindquarters sliding toward the edge. Takoda lunged for the bridle, his powerful arms straining to hold the panicking animal. "Cut! The saddle straps!" he commanded Anara. "We have to free it of the weight." Anara pulled his knife from her belt, sawing desperately at the rain-slicked leather. The horse thrashed, nearly pulling Takoda off the narrow ledge. With a final cut, the saddle came free, tumbling into the abyss below. Lightened, the horse found. Perches on the crumbling path, its eyes rolling white with fear. "Go!" Takoda shouted, pushing Anara ahead toward the cave. "I'll bring him after you!" She scrambled forward, mud clinging to her skirts, rain blinding her. The cave entrance was little more than a crack in the cliff wall, but it widened as she pushed inside, revealing a space large enough to shelter them all. She turned back to help Takoda, who was still struggling with the terrified horse. What happened next seemed to unfold in terrible slow motion. As Takoda coaxed the horse forward, a bolt of lightning struck a pine clinging to the cliff above them. The tree, its roots already weakened by the torrent, tore free in a shower of rock and soil. Anara screamed a warning, but her voice was lost in the crash of thunder. Takoda looked up, saw the danger, and made an instant decision. With all his strength, he shoved the horse forward along the path toward safety, directly into the cave, where Anara waited. The momentum carried the animal past her into the shelter, but the action left Takoda himself exposed as the falling tree and its cascade of debris struck the path. The ledge crumbled. Takoda lunged for solid ground, his fingers clawing at the rock. For one heart-stopping moment, Anara thought he would make it. Then the entire section gave way, and Takoda disappeared in a cloud of dust and rain. "No!" Anara screamed, rushing to the edge despite the danger. Through the curtain of rain, she could just make out Takoda's form, sprawled on a narrow ledge, perhaps 20 feet below. He wasn't moving. Without hesitation, she began searching for a way down. The cliff was near vertical, but years of erosion had created enough handholds for someone desperate enough to try. Securing the knife between her teeth and ignoring the protests of her still healing back, Anara lowered herself over the edge. The descent was a nightmare of slippery rock, pounding rain, and fear. Not for herself, but for the man who had risked everything to save her. Twice she nearly fell, her fingers numb with cold and strain, but the thought of Takoda dying alone on that ledge drove her onward. When she finally reached him, Anara's heart nearly stopped. Takoda lay unnaturally still, blood mixing with rainwater on his temple. For a terrible moment, she thought she was too late. Then his chest rose slightly, a shallow breath that filled her with desperate hope. "Takoda!" she called, gathering his head gently into her lap. "Takoda, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. The ledge they were on was barely wide enough for both of them, and the rain was intensifying, bringing with it a real risk of another collapse. Anara scanned their surroundings frantically, looking for any possible route to safety. Just below their precarious perch, she spotted what appeared to be a deeper hollow in the cliff face, not visible from the trail above. If she could somehow get Takoda there, they might have a chance to wait out the storm. Drawing on strength she didn't know she possessed, Anara managed to drag Takoda's unconscious form toward the hollow. It was indeed a small cave, dry and deep enough to protect them from the elements. Once inside, she worked quickly, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind the wound on his head, checking for broken bones, covering him with her shawl for warmth. As the storm raged outside, Anara held Takoda close, willing warmth back into his body, whispering prayers her mother had taught her, mixed with desperate pleas of her own creation. "You can't die," she told him fiercely. "Not here, not like this. You have a valley to show me, remember? And my mother to rescue, you promised." Whether it was her words or simply his own remarkable resilience, Takoda's breathing gradually steadied. When he finally opened his eyes, confusion gave way to recognition as he focused on her face. "Anara," he murmured. "How?" "Shh," she soothed. "Don't try to move yet. You fell when the path collapsed." He grimaced, attempting to sit up despite her warning. "The horse?" "Safe in the cave above. I came down for you." Dakota stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You climbed. Down in this storm?" "I wasn't going to leave you," she said simply. Something shifted in Dakota's expression, a softening, a surrender of some long-held resistance. His hand, cold but steady, found hers in the dimness of their shelter. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying a weight beyond their simplicity. They remained in that small cave throughout the day and into the night, the storm outside a reflection of the changes occurring within. Dakota's injuries, while painful, proved less severe than Anara had feared. A concussion, bruised ribs, a sprained ankle, but nothing broken. As night fell and the rain finally began to slacken, they took stock of their situation. Their supplies were gone, either with the horse in the cave above or lost in the canyon. The path back up appeared impassable after the landslide. Their only option was to continue downward once Dakota was strong enough to move. "The valley?" Anara asked, as they shared the last of the pemmican Dakota had carried in his pocket. "We can still reach it," he assured her. "This canyon leads toward it, though by a route I hadn't planned to take. And our pursuers," Dakota's smile held grim satisfaction. "Even army scouts won't follow our trail through Ghost Canyon in a storm. They'll be forced to take the long way around. If we can reach the valley before them." He didn't need to finish. The valley represented not just sanctuary, but the possibility of reinforcements, others like themselves who had chosen freedom over subjugation. As they settled for the night in their cramped shelter, Anara found herself studying Dakota's face. In the faint moonlight that now penetrated the storm clouds, the man who had seemed so forbidding at their first meeting now appeared different to her, still strong, still dangerous when needed, but also vulnerable, human. "Why are you looking at me that way?" he asked softly. "I'm trying to understand," she admitted. "Why you risked yourself for the horse. You could have let it fall." Dakota was silent for a long moment. "There has been enough death," he said finally. "The innocent should not suffer for our choices." In those simple words, Anara heard the echo of the healer he had been meant to be, the man who valued life above all else, who would climb down a cliff in a storm for a half-Cherokee maid he barely knew, who would risk himself for a frightened. "Horse, rest," she urged, adjusting the makeshift bandage on his head. "Tomorrow will test us both." As Dakota drifted into uneasy sleep, Anara remained awake, listening to the diminishing rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Something fundamental had changed between them in this canyon, a shift as significant as the landslide that had nearly claimed Dakota's life. They had entered Ghost Canyon as reluctant allies brought together by circumstance. Whatever emerged from its depths when morning came would be something else entirely, something neither of them had anticipated when their paths first crossed at a whipping post in Willow Creek. Dawn crept into Ghost Canyon with hesitant fingers, of light that barely penetrated the mist rising from the rain-soaked earth. Anara woke stiff and cold, her muscles protesting from the uncomfortable night spent in the small cave. Beside her, Dakota was already awake, his dark eyes clear despite the angry bruise that had bloomed across his temple. "How are you feeling?" she asked, noting how he held himself carefully to protect his injured ribs. "I've endured worse," he replied, which wasn't exactly an answer. "We should move while the light is good. The way down will be treacherous after the storm." Their descent through the lower canyon proved as challenging as Dakota had predicted. Without the horse or supplies, They were forced to navigate the steep terrain on foot, using branches as makeshift walking sticks. Takoda moved more slowly than usual, his characteristic grace hampered by his injuries, but his knowledge of the land remained unerring. By midday, they had reached the canyon floor, where a stream, now swollen to a rushing torrent by the previous day's rain, carved its path through the rock. Ancient cottonwoods lined the banks, their roots exposed by centuries of seasonal floods. The air here was different, cooler, heavy with moisture, alive with the songs of birds that had been absent. In the higher reaches, "We'll follow the water," Takoda said, pausing to drink from a clear pool formed by the stream. "It leads to a valley that connects with our destination." "How far?" Anara asked, kneeling beside him to quench her own thirst. The cold water tasted of minerals and something else, a sweetness she couldn't identify. 2 days, perhaps 3. At our current pace, he glanced at the sky, which had cleared to a brilliant blue. "The army scouts will be forced to circle around the canyon. That gives us some advantage." They continued downstream, the canyon gradually widening, its sheer walls giving way to more gentle slopes covered in pine and flowering shrubs. Game trails crisscrossed their path, and Takoda pointed out fresh deer tracks pressed into the soft earth. "We'll need food," he observed. Without his rifle lost in the landslide, hunting would be challenging but not impossible for someone with his skills. As if in answer, they rounded a bend to find themselves face to face with a young mule. Deer drinking from the stream. The animal froze, dark eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Before it could bolt, Takoda's hand flashed forward, his remaining knife, smaller than the one he had given Anara, flying true to strike the deer's throat. The animal dropped without a sound. Anara had seen animals butchered before, but never hunted. She watched with a mixture of awe and solemnity as Takoda approached the fallen deer, kneeling beside it to place his hand on its flank. "Thank you, brother, for your sacrifice," he murmured in Apache, then switched to English, perhaps for her benefit. "May your spirit run free in the high meadows." The ritual complete, he set to work with practiced efficiency, field dressing the deer and selecting the best portions to carry. Nothing was wasted. Even parts they couldn't take with them were left deliberately for other creatures of the forest. "My father used to hunt," Anara said as they continued their journey, now with fresh venison wrapped in leaves. "But I was too young to go with him. My mother said it wasn't proper for a girl to hunt. Among my people, women don't typically hunt large game," Takoda acknowledged. "But they learn how. In hard times, such knowledge means survival." He glanced at her appraisingly. "You have a steady hand. You could learn." The casual confidence in her abilities warmed Anara in a way she hadn't expected. In the Blackwood household, she had been constantly reminded of her limitations, too Indian to be trusted, too female to be respected, too poor to have choices. "I'd like that," she said simply. They made camp that evening in a small clearing near the stream. With flint struck against Takoda's knife blade, they managed to start a fire. The venison, seasoned with wild herbs Takoda gathered, was the first substantial meal they'd had in days. As they ate, Anara found herself thinking of her mother. How worried she must be, having received no letter or money from her daughter in weeks. The familiar guilt that had accompanied her throughout their journey resurfaced. "You're troubled," Takoda observed, his perception keen despite his own discomfort. "My mother," Anara admitted. "She depends on what little I could send from my wages. Without it," Takoda nodded in understanding. "The reservations are places of hunger. Your concern is justified." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "Tell me about her." The invitation, simple as it was, released a flood of memories Anara had kept carefully contained. She spoke of her mother, Niabi, a woman of quiet strength who had maintained her Cherokee ways despite being cut off from her people. She described the stories her mother had told of the forced removal, The months of walking through winter with inadequate food and shelter, the thousands who had died along the way. She lost her parents and 2 brothers on that march, Anara said softly. She was only 9 years old. Yet she survived, Takoda noted. Like you. She met my father years later when he came west to survey land for the railroad. She said he was different from other white men. He asked permission before crossing Cherokee territory, learned some of their language, respected their ways. Anara smiled at the memory. They scandalized everyone by marrying, but they were happy. When he died, something in her seemed to break. Takoda was silent for a long moment. And now she is at San Carlos, among strangers. Yes. The Indian agent said mixed bloods couldn't live independently. It was for her protection, Anara added bitterly. Protection, Takoda repeated, the word carrying all his contempt for such justifications. I know San Carlos well. My people were taken there too, though many of us left when conditions became unbearable. You escaped? We walked away, he corrected. 53 men, women, and children. The soldiers pursued us for weeks. His expression darkened with the memory. Not all of us reached the valley. The weight of shared history settled between them. Different tribes, different circumstances, but the same pattern of displacement and struggle. In that moment, Anara felt a connection to Takoda that transcended their brief acquaintance, a recognition that their individual stories were threads in the same complex tapestry. They slept that night on opposite sides of the fire, but somehow closer than they had been before. Morning brought renewed purpose and the discovery of wild blackberries growing in abundance along the stream bank. They gathered as many as they could carry in improvised pouches made from large leaves, the sweet tart juice staining their fingers purple. The canyon continued to widen as they traveled, eventually opening into a broad valley cradled between mountain ranges. The scenery had transformed dramatically. Lush meadows dotted with wildflowers stretched before them, herds of elk grazing in the distance, hawks circling lazily overhead. It's beautiful, Anara breathed, overwhelmed by the pristine landscape. After days in the confined space of the canyon, this is the outer valley, Takoda explained. The place we seek lies beyond that ridge. He pointed to a distant line of hills that separated this valley from what lay beyond. We'll reach it by tomorrow if we maintain our pace. They crossed the valley floor throughout the day, Takoda setting a steady rhythm despite his injuries. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they reached a curious formation of standing stones arranged in a rough circle. Ancient petroglyphs covered their surfaces, spirals, handprints, and animal figures similar to those Anara had seen at the sacred spring days earlier. What is this place? She asked, sensing its significance from Takoda's respectful demeanor as they approached. A boundary marker, he replied, and a meeting place. Different tribes have used this circle for centuries to discuss matters that affect all people: war, peace, hunting rights. He traced one of the carved symbols with his finger. Apache, Navajo, Hopi, Zuni, all have added their marks here. But no Cherokee, Anara noted, scanning the ancient artwork. Your mother's people lived far to the east, Takoda acknowledged. But perhaps it's time their mark joined the others. He offered her his knife handle first. If you wish. The suggestion caught Anara by surprise. I wouldn't know what to carve. Whatever speaks your truth, Takoda said simply. After a moment's hesitation, Anara accepted the knife. She selected a smooth section of one stone and with careful precision carved a simple symbol, a circular design her mother had shown her, representing harmony and balance in the Cherokee tradition. What does it mean? Takoda asked when she had finished. It's called the sacred fire, she explained. It represents the center around which all life revolves. Family, community, balance with the natural world. Takoda studied the symbol thoughtfully. A good choice for this place. They made camp within sight of the stone circle, building their fire smaller than usual. Though they had seen no sign of pursuit since the storm, caution had become second nature. As darkness fell, Anara noticed Takoda growing increasingly alert, his gaze frequently turning toward the hills they would cross tomorrow. "What troubles you?" she asked, echoing his question from the previous night. "We're being watched," he said quietly. Anara tensed, scanning the darkness beyond their fire. "The army scouts?" "No. Friends, I think. Sentinels from the valley." He relaxed slightly, though his vigilance didn't entirely fade. "They will have recognized me, but you are a stranger to them. Will they welcome me?" "They will be cautious," Takoda admitted. "Trust is earned slowly among those who have been betrayed many times, but you will not be turned away." The knowledge that they were being observed changed the atmosphere of their camp, though not entirely unpleasantly. There was comfort in the thought that they were no longer completely alone, that somewhere in the darkness, allies were standing guard. They crossed the final ridge shortly after noon the following day, climbing a steep but well-maintained trail that wound through pine forest and rocky outcroppings. At the summit, Takoda paused, waiting for Anara to join him. "Welcome," he said simply, gesturing to the view that spread before them, to Dine ta Naaznili. Anara's breath caught at the sight. Below them lay a hidden valley, invisible from any direction until this precise vantage point. A river meandered. Through its center, bordered by rich farmland where crops grew in neat rows, small clusters of dwellings dotted the landscape, some traditional hogans and wickiups, others simple cabins built of pine logs. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and in the distance a herd of horses grazed in a meadow enclosed by a simple fence. Most striking was the diversity evident even from this distance. The structures represented various tribal building styles, and the people moving among them wore clothing that combined traditional and adapted elements from multiple cultures. "How many?" Anara asked, trying to comprehend the scale of what she was seeing. "Nearly 300 now," Takoda answered with quiet pride. "Apache, Navajo, Hopi, some Ute and Comanche, former slaves from Texas, Mexican families displaced by border conflicts, even a few white settlers who chose to live by different rules than their kind." He glanced at her. "And now, one Cherokee." Before Anara could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Takoda straightened, whistling back in a different pattern. From the trees to their left emerged 3 men, 2 carrying rifles, 1 armed with a bow. They approached cautiously, eyes fixed on Anara. The oldest of the 3, a weathered man with silver streaking his black hair, addressed Takoda in Apache, too rapid for Anara to follow. Takoda responded calmly, occasionally gesturing toward her. She caught her own name and several mentions of Willow Creek and San Carlos. After a lengthy exchange, the older man switched to English, clearly for her benefit. "I am Maka," he said, studying her with sharp eyes. "Takoda says you were unjustly punished by the whites, and that you seek to rescue your mother from San Carlos." "Yes," Anara confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. "Why should we trust you? Half-bloods have betrayed us before, choosing their white father's ways when pressed." The question was blunt, but fair. Anara considered her answer carefully. "I have lived in both worlds," she said finally. "Been rejected by both. I don't ask you to trust me because of my blood or despite it. Judge me by my actions as Takoda did." Maka's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes shifted. He turned back to Takoda, speaking again in Apache. Whatever Takoda said in response seemed to satisfy him. "Come," Maka said, gesturing toward the path leading down into the valley. "The council will want to hear your story." As they descended, the true scope of what Takoda and his people had built became apparent. The valley wasn't just a hiding place, it was a functioning community with irrigated fields, orchards, workshops, and a central gathering place where a large fire pit stood ready for communal meals. Children stopped their play to watch the newcomers pass, their faces showing curiosity rather than fear. Women working at outdoor looms or tending cooking fires nodded in acknowledgement of Takoda's return. Several approached to greet him more personally, expressing concern at his visible injuries. They were led to a large, circular structure near the center of the settlement, a council house built in a style that combined elements of different tribal traditions. Inside, a fire burned in a central pit, and log benches formed a circle around it. Several elders, men and women of different tribal backgrounds, were already gathered, clearly having been summoned at the first sighting of Takoda's return. "Sit," Maka directed, indicating a place for Anara within the circle. "Tell your story, all of it." Takoda took a position opposite her, his presence reassuring despite the scrutiny of the council. With a deep breath, Anara began her narrative, her Cherokee mother's relocation, her father's death, her years of service at the Blackwood House, the false accusation, the public whipping, and Takoda's intervention. She spoke without embellishment or self-pity, stating facts as they had occurred. When she described her mother's situation at San Carlos, several council members exchanged knowing glances. An elderly woman with intricate facial tattoos, marking her as Hopi, spoke up when Anara had finished. "This one has endured much," she observed. "Her scars are still fresh, yet she climbed down a cliff in storm to save our chief." She turned to Takoda. "You trust her?" "With my life," Takoda said simply. "She has proven herself worthy of the valley's protection." The council deliberated in a mixture of languages, sometimes speaking directly to Takoda or asking Anara clarifying questions about her story. Finally, Maka rose to his feet. "Anara Stone, daughter of Niabi of the Cherokee. You are welcome in Dine Ta Nas Nili," he announced formally. "You will be given shelter, food, and the protection of our people." His expression softened slightly. "As for your mother, the council has agreed. When you are ready, a party will be formed to bring her safely from San Carlos." Relief washed over Anara in a wave so powerful she had to steady herself against the bench. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "I will work to earn my place here." "You already have," the Hopi woman said kindly, "by saving one who is precious to us all." As the council dispersed, Takoda approached, satisfaction evident in his usually guarded expression. "Come," he said, "there is a place prepared for you." He led her to a small but well-constructed cabin on the eastern edge of the settlement. Inside was simple but comfortable, a bed frame with a pine bough mattress covered in woven blankets, a table and chair, storage baskets, and a small fireplace. "This was built for a healer who died last winter," Takoda explained. "It has stood empty since. The women will bring you what you need." Anara turned slowly, taking in what was to be her new home. After years in a cramped servant's room at the Blackwood House, the small cabin seemed spacious and impossibly private. "Thank you," she said, emotion making her voice unsteady, "for everything." Takoda stood in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun. For a moment he appeared as he had that first day in Willow Creek, imposing, mysterious, dangerous. Then he smiled, transforming his face into something altogether different. "Rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow is soon enough to begin your new life." As he turned to leave, Anara called after him. "Takoda, you didn't tell them." He paused. "Tell them what?" "About the army scouts, the danger following us." Takoda's expression grew serious once more. "They know. Sentinels have been tracking our pursuers since we entered the valley approach. The council will decide how to handle them." He hesitated, then added, "Do not worry, you are safe here." With those words, he left her to the quiet of her new home, a sanctuary earned through suffering, courage, and the unexpected bond formed with a warrior who had seen beyond her dual heritage to the strength that lay beneath. As evening fell, Anara sat in the open doorway of her cabin, watching the community prepare for night. Cooking fires glowed in the gathering darkness. Voices called out in different languages that somehow formed a harmonious whole. Children were ushered to their beds with songs that spanned tribal boundaries. For the first time since leaving Willow Creek, Anara allowed herself to fully believe in the possibility of belonging, not as a half-blood caught between worlds, but as a woman valued for exactly who she was. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Army Scouts remained a threat. Her mother still waited, unaware, at San Carlos. The world beyond the valley continued in its cruel patterns of conquest and control. But tonight, as stars appeared above the hidden valley, Anara Stone dared to hope that she had finally found her way home. 3 weeks passed like water through, cupped hands, each day bringing Anara deeper into the rhythms of valley life. She learned to grind corn using traditional stone methods, to weave baskets tight enough to hold water, to identify plants with medicinal properties. Her cabin gradually took on her personality, a clay pot of wildflowers on the table, a Cherokee-style broom in the corner, herbs hanging from the rafters to dry. The valley's residents had moved from cautious acceptance to genuine welcome as they witnessed her willingness to learn, to contribute, to adapt. Children who had initially watched her from a distance now ran to her with treasures found in their explorations, unusually shaped stones, feathers, a turtle shell polished by time. The Hopi elder, whose name was Talasi, had taken a particular interest in her, sharing knowledge of healing that complemented what Anara had learned from her mother. But beneath the growing sense of belonging ran an undercurrent of urgency. The Army Scouts who had pursued them to the valley's edge had withdrawn, after encountering the settlement's defenders, but everyone knew they would return with reinforcements. More troubling were the rumors filtering in from travelers and traders. Judge Blackwood had expanded his search beyond his jurisdiction, offering a substantial reward for information leading to Anara's recovery and Takoda's capture. Preparations for the rescue mission to San Carlos intensified against this backdrop of external threat. Maps were studied, supplies gathered, contacts within the reservation quietly alerted. Takoda, fully recovered from his injuries, led these efforts with the strategic precision that had earned him his leadership position. Anara saw him frequently during these weeks, though always in the context of community work or mission planning. Something had shifted between them since their arrival in the valley, a subtle distance replacing the closeness forged during their journey. She told herself it was natural, that he had responsibilities beyond her welfare now that they had reached safety, but the explanation felt incomplete. One evening, as sunset painted the valley in shades of amber and gold, Anara found Takoda at the edge of the settlement, studying the western ridge, where sentinels maintained their vigilant watch. "The council has set the date," he said without preamble as she approached. "We leave for San Carlos in 3 days. Anara nodded, having anticipated this development. "How many will go?" 8 of us, small enough to move quickly, large enough for protection. He turned to face her fully. "Including you?" This surprised her. "I assumed I would wait here. The reservation guards know me." "Precisely why you must come," Takoda explained. "Your mother may not trust strangers, even those claiming to help. She needs to see your face." He hesitated, then added, "Unless you fear the risk." "No," Anara said immediately. "I want to be there. I need to be there." Something like approval flickered in Takoda's eyes. "Good. We leave before dawn on the 3rd day. Be ready." As he turned to go, Anara found herself unwilling to let the conversation end so abruptly. "Takoda!" she called after him. "Have I done something wrong?" He stopped, his back still to her. "Why would you think that? Since we arrived, you've been—" She searched for the right word. "Distant." For a long moment, Takoda remained motionless, silhouetted against the darkening sky. When he finally turned back to her, his expression was carefully neutral. "You have found your place here," he said. "That was my promise to you." "That doesn't answer my question." The directness of her response seemed to catch him off guard. The careful mask slipped, revealing something more complex beneath. A conflict he was struggling to resolve. "When a man has been too long at war," he said slowly, "peace becomes unfamiliar territory. I have led my people in resistance for many years. I have seen friends die, family lost, promises broken." His gaze moved from her face to the peaceful valley below. "What comes after the fighting? I'm not certain I remember how to live without an enemy at my back." The confession surprised Anara with its vulnerability. This was not the confident warrior who had lifted her from the dust of Willow Creek, nor the skilled guide who had navigated treacherous terrain. This was a man questioning his purpose, now that the immediate dangers had receded. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "you begin by allowing yourself to want something beyond survival." Takoda's eyes returned to her face, searching for something. Whatever he saw there caused him to straighten slightly, as if coming to a decision. "We will speak more of this," he promised, "when your mother is safely among us." With that, he walked away, leaving Anara with the distinct impression that far more had been said in their brief exchange than the words themselves conveyed. The 3 days passed in a flurry of preparation. Anara was fitted with clothing better, suited for the journey than her tattered dress. Buckskin leggings beneath a knee-length tunic, soft-soled moccasins that moved silently across any terrain, a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the summer sun. Talasi taught her to apply a salve that would protect her healing back from the rigors of long hours in the saddle. The rescue party gathered in pre-dawn darkness, their preparations conducted in near silence. Besides Takoda and Anara, the group included Maka and 5 other men chosen for their specific skills: tracking, marksmanship, knowledge of army procedures, familiarity with the San Carlos landscape. All were armed, all moved with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to high-stakes missions. They departed as the first hint of light touched the eastern sky, following a different route than the one Anara and Takoda had used to enter the valley. This path led through a narrow fissure in the northern ridge, barely wide enough for a horse and rider to pass single file. "The army doesn't know of this exit," Takoda explained as they emerged on the other side. "It keeps our primary approach concealed. The journey to San Carlos would take 4 days of hard riding if all went well. They traveled primarily at night, resting during daylight hours in locations carefully chosen for concealment. The group moved like shadows across the landscape, avoiding main trails and settlements, leaving minimal signs of their passage. On the 3rd night, they crested a hill that offered a clear view of their destination. San Carlos spread before them. In the valley below, a collection of government buildings surrounded by the makeshift dwellings of the reservation's inhabitants. Even from this distance, the contrast was stark between the solid structures occupied by agency officials and the inadequate shelters provided for the native residents. "Where will we find her?" Maka asked as they studied the layout. Anara pointed to the southeastern section. She mentioned being housed near the infirmary. "She helps with the sick when she can." Takoda nodded thoughtfully. "That area has less military presence." "Good." He turned to the group. "We'll approach from the south, after midnight when the guard changes. 2 will remain with the horses as lookouts, the rest continue on foot." The plan was methodical, accounting for contingencies and escape routes. As Anara listened, she was struck by the calm competence with which these men approached a mission that could easily end in their capture or death. This was not their first. Such rescue, she realized. While the outside world might view them as renegades or outlaws, they saw themselves as liberators, warriors continuing a fight by different means than their ancestors had envisioned. They made camp several miles from the reservation, concealed in a dense thicket of juniper and pinyon pine. As the others prepared a cold meal and established watch rotations, Takoda drew Anara aside. "Are you certain about your mother's location?" he asked, his voice low to avoid being overheard. "As certain as I can be," she replied. "Her last letter mentioned being near where they keep the medicine. That would be the infirmary." Takoda studied her face in the gathering darkness. "And if she chooses not to come? Some have built lives here, despite the hardships. They fear the consequences of leaving." The question hit at Anara's deepest fear, that her mother might reject. The rescue might have adapted to reservation life in ways that made the risk of escape seem too great. "She will come," Anara said, with more confidence than she felt. She never wanted to be there. The agent gave her no choice. Takoda seemed satisfied with her answer. "Rest now," he advised. "Tonight will demand all your strength." The hours before midnight stretched endlessly, tension building as the moment of action approached. When Takoda finally gave the signal to move, Anara's heart was pounding so forcefully she was certain everyone could hear it. They approached the reservation from the south as planned, leaving 2 men with the horses in a dry wash that offered both concealment and a quick route of escape. The remaining 6 advanced on foot, moving silently through the sparse vegetation that surrounded the government-controlled land. The reservation was not surrounded by walls or fences, its boundaries maintained more by threat than physical barrier. Still, guards patrolled at regular intervals, their lanterns casting pools of light in the darkness. Takoda led them between these patrols with uncanny precision, as if he could sense the movements of the soldiers before seeing them. They reached the cluster of dwellings near the infirmary without incident. Here the challenge intensified. Dozens of small shelters stood in rows, indistinguishable from one another in the darkness. Finding Niabi among them would be like locating a particular star in a crowded sky. Anara felt despair rising as she scanned the identical structures. Then Takoda touched her arm, pointing to a dwelling slightly apart from the others. A small bundle of what appeared to be herbs hung beside its entrance, a detail so subtle it would be meaningless to most observers, but which caught Anara's attention immediately. "Cherokee medicine," she whispered, recognizing the particular arrangement. "That's her sign." Takoda nodded to Maka, who positioned himself to watch the nearest patrol route. The others spread out to form a loose perimeter around the dwelling. Only Takoda accompanied Anara to the entrance. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What if her mother didn't recognize her? What if she cried out in surprise, alerting the guards? What if... Takoda's hand settled on her shoulder, solid and reassuring. "Your mother waits," he said simply. Drawing a deep breath, Anara pushed aside the cloth that served as a door and stepped into the darkness beyond. "Mother?" she called softly. A rustling sound came from the far corner, then a voice that froze Anara's heart mid-beat. "Anara, is it truly you?" "Yes," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "I've come to take you home." A figure rose from a pallet on the floor, slender, slightly stooped, moving with the careful precision of one whose joints caused pain. As Niabi stepped into the faint moonlight filtering through the doorway, Anara had to suppress a cry. Her mother had aged years in the months since they'd last seen each other, her once black hair now streaked with white, her face lined with suffering, yet her eyes, those remained unchanged, dark and intelligent, widening now with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "My daughter," she breathed, reaching out with trembling hands. "They said you had disappeared, that you had abandoned your position. I feared—" She broke off, unable to complete the thought. "I didn't abandon you," Anara said fiercely, clasping her mother's hands. "I was accused falsely, punished, but I found help." She gestured toward Takoda, who had remained respectfully at the entrance. "We've come to bring you to a safe place." Niabi's gaze shifted to Takoda, assessing him with the wisdom of one who had survived by reading intentions accurately. "Apache," she said, not a question but a recognition. Takoda inclined his head slightly. "I am Takoda, once chief of the Red Rock Band. Now I lead those who seek freedom from places like this." "There is little time," Anara urged. "Will you come with us, mother?" Niabi hesitated, glancing around the sparse dwelling that had been her prison for nearly 2 years. "What will happen to those left behind?" "We cannot save everyone tonight," Takoda said gently, "but each person we free strengthens our community. In time, perhaps many more will find their way to us." The answer seemed to satisfy her. "Give me a moment to gather my medicines," she said, moving with renewed purpose to collect a small bundle of possessions. Outside, a low whistle signaled approaching danger. Takoda tensed, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "Guards coming," he warned. "We must move now." Niabi joined them at the entrance, a small parfleche containing her belongings clutched to her chest. Despite her age and the privations she had suffered, she stood straight, her eyes clear and determined. "I am ready." They slipped from the dwelling into the moonlit night, rejoining the others who had maintained their protective formation. Mahka signaled the direction of the approaching. "Patrol, 2 guards, moving slowly along the row of dwellings." "This way," Takoda murmured, guiding them toward the darkness beyond the infirmary. They had covered perhaps half the distance to safety when disaster struck. A guard, not part of the regular patrol, emerged from between buildings, nearly colliding with their group. His startled exclamation was cut short by Mahka's swift action. Not a killing blow, but one that rendered the soldier unconscious before he could raise a proper alarm. Still, the damage was done. The brief commotion had alerted the other guards, who now shouted and began moving in their direction, lanterns raised high. "Run!" Takoda ordered, all pretense of stealth abandoned. They fled through the darkness, Anara supporting her mother, who moved with surprising speed despite her years and health. Behind them, shouts and the sound of pursuit grew steadily louder. A shot rang out, the bullet whistling harmlessly overhead, a warning rather than a genuine attempt to kill. The dry wash where they had left the horses seemed impossibly distant. Niabi was struggling now, her breath coming in painful gasps. Without hesitation, Takoda lifted her into his arms, never breaking stride as he carried her burden. By the time they reached the horses, the reservation was in full alarm. Lights blazed from the agency buildings, and mounted soldiers were already organizing a pursuit. Their small group scrambled onto their mounts, Niabi sharing Anara's horse, and set off at a gallop along the dry stream bed that offered their best. Chance of escape? They rode hard through the night, changing direction frequently to confuse pursuers, using every trick known to those who had spent lifetimes evading government forces. When dawn broke, they had put considerable distance between themselves and San Carlos, but the danger was far from past. "They'll send riders to all the nearby settlements," Mahka predicted as they paused to rest the horses. "Telegraph messages to army outposts. They'll bring in trackers." "Then we avoid settlements and outposts," Takoda replied calmly, "and we leave no trail for trackers to follow." The journey back to the valley became a chess match of movement and counter-movement. They traveled on rocky ground that held no tracks, crossed streams to break their scent, split up and rejoined at predetermined locations. When they were forced to cross open territory, they did so at night, under clouded skies that concealed them from watchers. Through it all, Niabi demonstrated the resilience that had allowed her to survive the Trail of Tears as a child, the loss of her husband, the forced relocation to San Carlos. Though physically weakened by reservation conditions, her spirit remained unbroken, her mind sharp as she contributed suggestions drawn from Cherokee evasion tactics. On the 6th day of their return journey, as they approached the hidden entrance to the valley, Dakota called a halt. The others continued on, while he, Anara, and Niabi remained behind temporarily. "Before we enter," he explained to Niabi, "there is something you should know. The valley holds many people from many tribes, some traditional enemies of each other. We have put aside old hatreds to build something new." His gaze was direct, respectful. "You are the first Cherokee to join us. Your wisdom will be valued, but the adjustment may not be simple." Niabi considered his words, her weathered face thoughtful. "When I was a girl," she said finally, "my grandmother told me that before the white man came, there were times when different peoples would gather in peace to trade, to conduct ceremonies, to arrange marriages. Enemies became allies when necessity demanded." She looked from Dakota to her daughter. "Is that not what you have created, a return to the old ways of cooperation?" "Yes," Dakota agreed, clearly struck by her perspective, though we had not thought of it precisely in those terms. "Then I will find my place there," Niabi said with quiet confidence, "as my daughter has." At these words, Anara felt a surge of emotion. Pride in her mother's strength, relief at her acceptance, and something deeper, connected to the way Dakota had included her in his description of the valley's purpose. Not as a refugee or guest, but as someone who belonged. They entered the valley as afternoon sunlight bathed the community in golden light. Word of their successful return had preceded them, and residents gathered to welcome the rescued Niabi, with a mixture of curiosity and genuine warmth. Talasi immediately took charge of the older woman, leading her to a dwelling near Anara's that had been prepared during their absence. That evening, a celebration was held to welcome Niabi and honor the successful rescue mission. Food was shared, stories exchanged, and for the first time, Anara heard Cherokee words mingling with Apache, Navajo, Hopi, and the other languages that formed the valley's unique chorus. As the gathering continued around the central fire, Dakota sought Anara out where she sat slightly apart, watching her mother interact with her new neighbors. "She adapts quickly," he observed, settling beside her. "The Cherokee have been adapting for generations," Anara replied. "Sometimes I think it's the only reason any of us survived." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the firelight playing. Across their features, the sounds of conversation and occasional laughter creating a sense of normalcy that had been absent during their dangerous mission. "You asked me once," Dakota said finally, "what comes after fighting?" "I've been considering your answer," Anara turned to him curious. "And, wanting something beyond survival," he repeated her words. "I've spent so long focused on the next battle, the next escape, the next rescue, that I forgot to consider what we're building here beyond a refuge." His gaze moved across the gathered community, then returned to her face. "This valley is not just a place to hide. It's the beginning of something new, a way of living that honors the old traditions while creating space for what comes next." "And what comes next for you?" Anara asked softly. Dakota's expression shifted, the warrior's mask giving way to something more vulnerable, more human. "I am not certain," he admitted, "but I know I no longer wish to walk that path alone." The implication hung in the air between them, neither a declaration nor a question, but an opening, a possibility that had been building since that first momentous meeting in Willow Creek. "Then don't," Anara said simply, her hand finding his in the darkness beyond the firelight. As the celebration continued around them, Dakota and Anara remained side by side, their shoulders touching, their fingers intertwined. Two survivors who had found in each other not just safety or purpose, but the promise of a shared future neither could have imagined separately. In the days and years that followed, the legend of the half-Cherokee Maid and the Apache chief would spread throughout the territories, a story whispered around campfires, passed between tribes, a beacon of hope for others seeking escape from oppression and a path towards something new. For in a world determined to divide people by blood and birth, they had created a different way forward, not caught between cultures, but building bridges across them, one rescue, one story, one day at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.